reason God knows what you will choose to do is because you choose to do it, not vice versa. In other words, if you choose differently, then God would know differently. And so the reason, in other words, it's a logical order versus the causal order of decree or knowledge. The reason God knows it is because you chose it. You don't choose it because God knew it. Make sense?
All right, so this gets interesting because the majority view, the free will view, which says that even in the logical order of the mind of God, you don't exist yet. God is somehow knowing what you'll do. There's only two ways that knowledge can be had, logically speaking. Either you can determine what you know from within yourself, or you can learn what you know from outside yourself. There is no third option. And when it comes to God, I think all Christians are going to admit that God is not learning anything, right? He knew everything about creation before he created it. So the idea that before creation existed, only God existed, he can't be learning anything. Everything that he knows about creation, logically speaking, must be determined from within himself. And to be honest, that should be the end of the debate. The debate should be over on that basis. That you either know what you know because you determined it, or you know what you know because you learned it. Since God's not learning it, he must be determining it, and therefore the debate's over. God knows everything he knows about creation because he determined it all as the creator. And I already covered this in the grounding objection. When you start with only God, then anything that he knows is going to be the results of his actions, his creation, his sustainment, moment by moment, so on and so forth. And this is why you either have God knowing what he knows because he determined it from within himself, or you have God knowing what he knows because he learned it from something outside of himself. And free will, logically speaking, if you think about it, is a view which says that there are aspects of God's knowledge which are in fact determined by you and not by him.
The reason God knows what you will choose to do is because you choose to do it, not vice versa. In other words, if you choose differently, then God would know differently.
And therefore, it makes no logical sense to say that you're existing only in the mind of God prior to creation, and yet you're not, and yet you're still somehow also determining his thoughts, right? This is just, once again, a very logically inconsistent view. Since we're having a logical discussion, we're discussing the logical order of what is happening in the mind of God in eternity past as he plans creation out. Both sides of this issue, free will or not, are going to agree and admit that that what is occurring in time, what is unfolding in time, is the outplay of what God has planned in eternity past. But obviously, a free will side would say that God reactively planned it. The Calvinist side would say that God actively planned it. Nevertheless, back to the point, both sides admit that there must be a logical order in the mind of God as he plans creation out. So since both sides agree on that, it needs to be recognized that God's foreknowledge must be grounded. This is where the grounding objection comes in. God's foreknowledge must be grounded in something that comes before it. You cannot start off in the logical order. You cannot start God's foreknowledge off at the point where people are making choices and just ignore how those people came into existence in the first place to be making those choices, right? Logically, prior to God knowing anything about you, he has to first foreknow that you will exist. This is very simple and very basic, right? God can't know anything about you unless he first foreknows that you will exist. So the question that needs to be asked is, who is it that's responsible for your existence? And for any Christian, the answer is obvious. It's God, it's not you, right? So God is actually foreknowing that you will exist. He is foreknowing the results of his own action. He is not foreknowing the results of something he has nothing to do with. And this is probably the most critical point that could be made throughout this entire episode, and I will repeat it over and over and over again. God's foreknowledge is not based upon things he has nothing to do with, okay? So you cannot ignore, and this is because of the verses I just read. Hebrews 1:3, he didn't just create everything, he upholds everything by his power. Acts 17, in God we live and move and have our being. Colossians 1, in God created all things, and in God all things consist. These verses are always true, and therefore the idea that something can either exist or be occurring apart from the power of God that God has nothing to do with is logically impossible. So you cannot ignore God's act to create you when you're talking about God foreknowing your choices. God's foreknowledge must logically include his own action to create you in the logical order. So it could be said, as a simple statement, that God knows that by creating you, you will do X, Y, and Z. But notice how I haven't left out the fact that God is creating you, and therefore his knowledge of you doing X, Y, and Z is grounded upon, and in fact only exists in his mind because he has first considered creating you. God knows that by creating you, you will do X, Y, and Z. Okay? So, if he does not first consider creating you, his knowledge of you doing X, Y, and Z would not even exist in his mind in the first place. So you cannot talk about God foreknowing the future choices of free creatures, right? That fancy phrase. You cannot talk about God foreknowing the future choices of free creatures and disconnect your choices from God's action to create you. Otherwise, the statement itself that I said, God knowing that by creating you, that statement becomes completely irrelevant, right? God is not now knowing by creating you X, Y, and Z. He's just knowing X, Y, and Z out of nowhere, out of the blue. And it's completely illogical. The true reality is that God foreknows everything he knows about you in your future because he first foreknow that he would create you. Now, since before creation exists, that's the discussion we're having. Both sides are having this discussion. Since before creation exists, the only thing that exists is God, right? And you're starting with only God, then God can only be foreknowing the results of his own actions. It doesn't matter how far into the future he looks. Everything that he's going to be considering is going to be the results of his considering his own actions to create or sustain, right? So it makes no logical sense to say that he is foreknowing things he has nothing to do with when everything that exists is created by him and everything that happens or ever will happen in creation is sustained by him, okay? There is no such thing as something occurring that God has nothing to do with. So people like to say, one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my theological studies and discussions and all these sorts of things, people just like to say, well, just because God foreknows something will happen does not mean that he caused it. But this would only be true, once again, if there were things existing or occurring that God had nothing to do with, right? Again, the only things that exist are things that God created and sustained. The idea that God could be foreknowing things he had nothing to do with could only be true if there were, I say this sarcastically, but if there were other gods out there creating their own things that God then looks over at and begins to know things about, right? But that would be God learning, that would be God taking in knowledge from outside of himself. Nobody believes that, obviously. And so this is why when people try to say, well, I can look over at things that I had nothing to do with, and know or foreknow things about them, things that I had nothing to do with. So if I can do that, why can't God? And the reason you can do that is precisely because you're not God. It's precisely because of the verses, Hebrews 1:3 and Acts 17 that I just read. You can look over at things you had nothing to do with and know and foreknow things that you had nothing to do with precisely because you are not God. You can do that precisely because there are things that you did not create and sustain that are occurring around you. There's trillions of things occurring around you that you did not create, you did not sustain, and therefore you can know and foreknow things about them because you're not God. But notice something important. You are learning that knowledge, right? It is, you are taking in the knowledge from outside of yourself because it's things that you had nothing to do with. So this is why the idea of free will is such a dangerous logical view when it begins to say things like we create our choices out of nothing, or we are our own first mover. It begins to present a worldview where there are in fact things that are occurring or created by something or someone, in this case you, other than God, right? And it presents the idea that there are things happening which are sustained by a power or caused by a power other than God. And what I want to get across to people is that the Bible knows nothing of this. The three verses that I read, Hebrews 1:3, Acts 17, and Colossians 1, completely exclude the, the idea that there are the semi-deistic, dualistic idea that there are other ultimate powers at work in the universe. We'll see you guys next time, and remember to stay consistent, my friends.